The reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I sat in the back of the law office, the same wood-paneled room where my father had brought me as a child when he was teaching me about contracts and handshake deals and the difference between legal and right. My stepmother, Vivian, sat at the front of the room like she already owned it. She was dressed in black, but the expression on her face wasn't grief. It was triumph. Harrison Taylor, my father's attorney for 34 years, adjusted his reading glasses and began to speak. I, David Taylor, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. Vivian reached over and squeezed her son Derek's hand. My stepbrother, 29 years old, had already started looking at real estate listings on his phone under the table. They had been planning this day for years. They just didn't know that my father had been planning longer. To my beloved wife, Vivian Taylor, I leave the marital home, all personal property contained therein, and a cash bequest of $500,000 to ensure her comfort and security. Vivian's smile was small but sharp. She'd been after that house since the day she married my father 11 years ago. A 6-bedroom colonial on 12 acres in Fairfield County, built in 1892, restored over 20 years by a man who believed that things built to last were the only things worth building. She'd made it clear from the beginning that she expected to die in that house. She just hadn't expected my father to die first. To my stepson, Derek Vance, I leave the sum of $100,000 in recognition of our time as a blended family, with the hope that he uses it toward meaningful pursuits. Derek's face flickered. $100,000 was less than he'd expected. Far less. He'd been counting on at least a third of the estate, maybe more. Vivian's grip on his hand tightened. There would be time to address this later, her expression said. The will wasn't finished. Harrison cleared his throat. The remainder of my estate, including all investment accounts, business holdings, real estate properties beyond the marital home, and all other assets not specifically mentioned above, I leave to. He paused. Vivian leaned forward. My son, James Taylor. The room went cold. Vivian's head snapped around, her eyes finding me in the back corner, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickering edges of rage. That's not possible, she said. Not asked. Stated. As though her denial could change the words that had already been spoken. Harrison continued reading. To my son, I leave the entirety of my residual estate, with the understanding that certain assets have been placed in a trust structure requiring his sole authorization for access. I have every confidence in his ability to manage what I have built. Vivian was on her feet now. Harrison, this is a mistake. David and I discussed this. The estate was supposed to be... The will you're referring to, Harrison said calmly, was signed in 2019 before your marriage. This will, executed 6 months ago, is the controlling document. 6 months ago, when my father was already sick, already knowing what was coming, and already seeing clearly enough to make his final arrangements without interference. This will be contested, Vivian said, her voice low and dangerous. I have rights as a surviving spouse. You can't just... You can contest it, Mrs. Taylor, Harrison said, but I would advise against it. There are additional documents that will be revealed in the course of litigation that may not reflect favorably on certain parties. The threat was measured, precise, and devastating. Vivian sat back down slowly, her mind clearly racing through possibilities, calculating what my father might have documented, what evidence he might have left behind. I stood up from my chair and walked to the front of the room. Vivian, I said, the house is yours. The $500,000 is yours. You're taken care of. But everything else, everything my father built before you ever walked into his life, that stays with his family. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in 11 years, I saw something other than contempt in them. I saw fear. Welcome to family reckoning. I'm sharing this story because somewhere out there, someone else is watching a step-parent or a sibling or a relative position themselves to take what isn't theirs, thinking nobody is paying attention. They're wrong. Drop your state or country in the comments below so I know where my family is watching from. Also, Please note this story contains dramatic elements created for educational and entertainment purposes. The core lessons, however, are very real. My father was not a man who shared his plans. David Taylor built a commercial real estate empire from nothing, starting with a single strip mall in Bridgeport in 1983 and expanding over 4 decades into a portfolio worth, I would later learn, approximately $20 million. He was the kind of quiet, methodical builder who believed that success was measured not by what you owned, but by what you left behind that couldn't be taken from you. He married my mother in 1982. She died in 2009, after 27 years of marriage, and I watched him grieve in the way he did everything else, privately, thoroughly, without asking for help or offering explanations. He didn't remarry for 4 years. When Vivian entered his life, I was 26 years old, living in Boston, working as a project manager for a construction firm, and too busy building my own career to pay close attention to who had started appearing in my father's life. The wedding was small. Vivian was elegant, polished, and warm in the way that people can be warm when they want something. Derek was 18, recently graduated from high school, and already had the entitled slouch of someone who'd been told his whole life that the world owed him comfort. I attended the ceremony, shook hands, made appropriate small talk, and returned to Boston with a vague unease I couldn't quite articulate. Over the next several years, that unease crystallized into something I recognized but couldn't prove. Vivian was meticulous about positioning herself. She managed my father's social calendar, his household staff, his public appearances. She became the filter through which information flowed, the gatekeeper of access to the man who had built an empire with his own hands. When I visited, she was always gracious, too gracious, the kind of gracious that reminded you that you were a guest in a home that had once been yours. "James, how lovely to see you. Your father was just saying he wished you'd call more often." The implication was always there, always subtle. I was the neglectful son. She was the devoted wife. The distance between my father and me was my fault, not a natural result of lives lived in different cities with different demands and different rhythms. I didn't realize until much later that she was systematically rewriting the narrative of our relationship. My father was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in January of last year. He was 72 years old, had worked harder than any 3 men I'd ever known, and had never been good at slowing down. The diagnosis was serious but not immediately terminal. With proper management, he could have years left. Vivian called me with the news, her voice calibrated to convey just the right amount of concerned wife. "Your father needs to rest, James. The doctor says stress is the worst thing for his condition. I'm going to need you to be mindful of that when you visit. No business talk, no pressure about the company, just family time." Translation: don't ask questions. Don't poke around. Let me handle everything. For the next 8 months, I was carefully managed. My calls were returned at Vivian's convenience. My visits were scheduled around medical appointments and rest periods and the mysterious rhythms of a household that apparently operated on a schedule I wasn't privy to. My father and I spoke, but the conversations felt filtered, as though someone had installed a soundproof barrier between us that I couldn't see but could feel. "I'm fine, son," he would say, his voice thinner than it used to be. "Vivian takes good care of me. Don't worry." But I was worried. Not because I doubted Vivian's competence, she was unfailingly competent, but because I doubted her motives. And because I knew my father well enough to know that he was too proud to admit when something was wrong. In August, I drove down for an unscheduled visit. I didn't call ahead, didn't coordinate with Vivian's assistant, just showed up at the house on a Saturday morning with coffee and the pretense of being in the area for a work meeting. The housekeeper, Maria, opened the door with a look that told me everything I needed to know. "Mr. James," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "your father is in the study. Mrs. Taylor is at a charity luncheon until 3. I stepped inside and found my father sitting in his leather chair, papers spread across his desk, looking thinner and grayer than he had 3 months earlier. But his eyes were sharp, and when he saw me, something flickered across his face that I hadn't seen in years. Relief. "James," he said. "You came." "I came," I said, setting down the coffee. Dad, what's going on? He looked at the door, making sure it was closed. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I need you to take this, he said, handing it to me. Don't open it here. Don't tell Vivian. Keep it somewhere safe and don't open it until after. After what? He met my eyes. After I'm gone. And James, when you open it, you'll understand things I couldn't say out loud. Things I'm not sure I even fully understand yet. I took the envelope. It was heavy, thick with documents. I slipped it into my jacket without another word. You shouldn't have come without telling her, he said quietly. She'll be angry. Let her be angry, I said. I'm your son. He smiled then, a real smile, the kind I remembered from before Vivian, before the distance, before everything became complicated. Yes, he said. You are. I didn't open the envelope. Not then, not during the months that followed. My father had asked me to wait, and I trusted him enough to obey that instruction even when every instinct screamed at me to look. I stored it in a safety deposit box at a bank in Boston that Vivian didn't know about, and I waited. My father died on October 14th. Congestive heart failure, complicated by pneumonia. Vivian called me at 6 a.m. with the news, her voice appropriately grief-stricken, but I noticed she didn't tell me until after the funeral arrangements had already been made. I didn't want to burden you with the details, she explained. You were in Boston, and there was so much to handle. I hope you understand. I understood perfectly. She controlled the narrative, the timing, the access. She had managed my relationship with my father in his final months, and now she would manage his death the same way. The funeral was at the church my father had attended for 40 years. Vivian sat in the front row, dressed in black, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of a woman who had prepared for this moment. Derek sat beside her, his expression appropriately somber, though I noticed he checked his phone during the eulogy. I sat in the second row, alone, watching the woman who had systematically isolated my father from me while claiming to protect him. The woman who had made herself indispensable while making me seem distant and disinterested. The woman who thought she had won. She didn't know about the envelope. She didn't know about the meeting in August, the whispered instructions, the documents my father had hidden from her. She thought she had controlled everything. She was wrong. Before I reveal what was in that envelope, let me know you're still with me. Comment still here, or drop 100 points below so I know you're following this story. What my father left behind would change everything Vivian thought she knew about her marriage, her future, and the man she thought she had managed. And just a heads up, the following events incorporate dramatic storytelling elements for educational purposes. If that's not your style, feel free to click away. But if you want to see exactly how a dying man outsmarted the person trying to control his legacy, let's keep going. The envelope contained 4 documents. I opened them in my apartment in Boston the night after the funeral, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and the weight of everything I hadn't known. The first document was a handwritten letter from my father, dated August 12th, the day I'd visited him. James, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I need you to know some things I couldn't say while I was alive. I know what Vivian has been doing. I've known for longer than I want to admit. The isolation, the manipulation, the careful way she's positioned herself between us. I watched it happening and I let it happen because I was tired and sick and she was there and you weren't. That's not your fault. It's mine. I chose comfort over truth, and I'm sorry. But I didn't make her choices easy. Everything you need is in the documents that follow. I've had my attorneys working on this for 2 years, building a structure she can't touch and can't break. She gets the house. She gets $500,000. That's more than she deserves, but it's enough to keep her from having grounds to contest the estate. And it's enough to let me sleep at night knowing I didn't leave her destitute. Everything else, everything I built before her, everything I built during our marriage that I protected from her reach goes to you, but it's not as simple as a will. I've structured it in ways that require your active participation to access. You're going to be angry when you read this. You're going to wonder why I didn't say something sooner, why I didn't confront her, why I let her push you away. I don't have a good answer. I only have the truth. I was afraid of dying alone, and she made sure I believed that without her, I would. Don't make the same mistake. Don't let fear make you small. I love you, son. I always have. I'm proud of the man you've become, Dad. I read the letter 3 times. By the third reading, I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. The grief not just for his death but for the years we'd lost, the conversations we should have had, the truth that had been buried under Vivian's careful management. Then I opened the second document. It was a trust agreement. The David Taylor Family Trust, dated January 2023, nearly 2 years before his death. The trust held ownership of Taylor Properties LLC, the holding company for all his commercial real estate investments, 12 properties across Connecticut and Massachusetts, valued at approximately $20 million. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary and the sole trustee. Vivian was not mentioned anywhere in the document. But there was a catch. The trust had a mechanism requiring a 2-step activation process. First, the executor of my father's will had to confirm that the estate had been distributed according to the terms of the will. Second, I had to present a specific document, a certificate of trust, to the bank that held the trust accounts. That certificate was the third document in the envelope. It was signed by my father, notarized, and included a complex series of codes and account numbers that I would need to access the funds. The fourth document was a letter from Harrison Taylor, my father's attorney, dated the same day. James, if you're reading this, you've learned about the trust. I've been asked by your father to confirm the following. The David Taylor Family Trust is a valid, irrevocable trust created under Connecticut law. It holds title to all assets of Taylor Properties LLC, including but not limited to commercial properties in Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, Stamford, Springfield, and Worcester. The total value of trust assets as of the most recent appraisal is $19,847,000. The trust was funded in January 2023 through a series of transactions that transferred ownership of the LLC membership interests from your father personally to the trust. These transfers were conducted in accordance with all applicable laws and were reviewed by independent counsel to ensure they could not be challenged. Mrs. Taylor was not informed of these transfers, and she has no legal standing to challenge them. The assets were your father's separate property prior to the marriage, and the transfers were made before any claims of marital contributions could be established. I have the original trust documents in my office, along with all supporting transfer records. I am prepared to assist you in accessing the trust assets when you are ready. Please call me when you've had time to process everything. Harrison Taylor. $20 million. 12 properties. A trust structure so airtight that Vivian couldn't touch a single dollar. My father had spent his final 2 years building a fortress around his life's work, knowing that Vivian would try to take it, knowing that he had to protect it from her, and he had left me the key. Vivian called me 3 days after the funeral. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the edge beneath it. James, we need to discuss the estate. Harrison seems to be dragging his feet on distribution, and I'm concerned there are complications. There are no complications, I said. The will is clear. The house and the $500,000 are yours. Everything else is taken care of. Taken care of how? James, I was married to your father for 11 years. I have rights. If Harrison is trying to hide assets or delay distribution, I will absolutely pursue legal action. I could have told her then. I could have explained that the assets she was looking for didn't exist in the estate at all. They were in a trust she couldn't touch, created long before she ever started planning her inheritance. But something stopped me. Something my father had said in his letter. Something about not letting fear make me small. Vivian, I said, I think you should talk to Harrison directly. He can explain the structure of the estate better than I can. He's not returning my calls. I'm sure he'll get back to you. He's been busy. The silence that followed was heavy with everything she wanted to say but couldn't. She knew something was wrong. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her carefully constructed plans. But she didn't know enough to fight back. James, she said finally, I know you're angry about how things ended between you and your father. I know you think I kept you apart. But I want you to understand, I was trying to protect him. He was sick and vulnerable, and you were pushing him about business matters when he needed peace. And you don't believe I was? I believe you were acting in your best interest. And I believe my father knew that, which is why he made the arrangements he made. What arrangements? Talk to Harrison. I hung up. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. Vivian's attorney. Mr. Taylor, I'm calling on behalf of Vivian Taylor regarding your father's estate. We've received the preliminary accounting from Harrison Taylor's office, and we have some concerns about the disposition of certain assets. Which assets? The commercial properties. According to the estate filings, those properties are not listed as estate assets. We need to understand where they went. They went into a trust, I said. A trust my father created 2 years ago, funded with his separate property, of which I am the sole beneficiary. The trust is irrevocable, properly executed, and legally unassailable. Your client has no claim to any of those assets. The pause that followed was long enough for me to hear the attorney breathing, processing, recalculating. I'll need to see the trust documents. Harrison has them. He'll be happy to share whatever is legally required. But I want to be clear about something. My father made his intentions explicit. He left your client with a house worth $1.8 million, $500,000 in cash, and all the personal property inside the home. She is not destitute. She is not being cheated. She is receiving exactly what he intended her to receive. Mr. Taylor, I would strongly advise against taking a confrontational approach here. Spousal claims in Connecticut are taken very seriously, and then take it to court, I said. I'm not afraid of litigation. My father wasn't either. He built this structure specifically to withstand a challenge. If your client wants to spend her $500,000 on lawyers trying to break an irrevocable trust that was funded with premarital assets, she's welcome to try. But I'm told the legal fees alone will eat up most of her inheritance before she gets anywhere near the trust. The attorney was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll discuss this with my client and get back to you. You do that. The legal battle lasted 4 months. Vivian filed a motion to challenge the trust, claiming that my father had been under undue influence when he created it, that the assets were marital property subject to equitable distribution, and that I had somehow manipulated him into cutting her out. It was a desperate argument, and it failed at every level. The trust documents were reviewed by a retired judge appointed as a special master. He found that the trust had been created voluntarily, with independent legal counsel, and that my father had been of sound mind at the time of execution. The funding transactions were traced and verified, showing that the properties had been acquired before the marriage or with separate funds. Vivian's claim of undue influence was dismissed for lack of evidence. In the end, she was ordered to pay her own legal fees, which totaled nearly $80,000, and the trust was confirmed as valid. I visited the house one last time, 5 months after my father's death, to collect a few personal items I'd asked Maria to set aside. Vivian met me at the door, dressed casually for the first time I could remember, her face showing the wear of months of failed litigation. James, she said flatly. Vivian. She stepped aside to let me in. The house looked the same, but different. The energy had changed, the careful curation of Vivian's perfect life showing cracks I'd never noticed before. You knew, she said as I walked past her into the living room. That day in August when you visited him, you knew what he was planning. I knew he was preparing something. I didn't know what until after the funeral. She sat down in the chair that had been my father's, the one he'd read in every evening for 20 years. The proprietary way she settled into it made something twist in my chest. He never trusted me, she said quietly. 11 years, and he never fully trusted me. He trusted you with his life. He didn't trust you with his legacy. Those are different things. She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw something vulnerable in her expression. A woman who had spent 11 years trying to secure a future that was never truly hers. Why did he marry me if he didn't trust me? I think he did love you in his way, but love and trust aren't the same thing. He loved you enough to take care of you. He just didn't trust you enough to give you everything. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the familiar hardness. I could have made him happy, she said. I did make him happy. I'm sure you did. And he made sure you were taken care of. But the things he built before you, the things that represented his life's work, his identity, his legacy, those belonged to his family. To me. I collected the items Maria had set aside. A photo album from my parents' wedding, my father's watch, a small wooden box that had belonged to his father. Simple things. Meaningful things. Goodbye, Vivian. She didn't respond. She was still sitting in my father's chair, staring at the wall, when I closed the door behind me. The trust released its first distribution 6 months after my father's death. I used the funds to pay off the remaining debt on the properties, to establish a maintenance fund for the buildings, and to set up a scholarship program in my father's name at the community college where my mother had taught English. I didn't sell anything. My father had built these properties over 40 years, and I wasn't going to undo that work. I hired a property management company to handle day-to-day operations and kept my job in Boston, visiting Connecticut once a month to check on things. Derek called me once, about 8 months after everything settled. He was drunk, and his voice had the slurred bravado of someone who'd been rehearsing a conversation in his head. You think you won, he said. You think you're so smart, hiding money from my mother, cutting us out of what we deserved. I didn't hide anything. Your mother got the house and $500,000. That's more than most people get from their spouse's estate. She was his wife for 11 years. She was entitled to half of everything. She was entitled to what the law gave her, which is what she got. The trust was created with separate property. She had no claim to it. She deserved more. Your mother deserved a husband who trusted her completely. My father couldn't give her that. But he did give her financial security for the rest of her life. That's not nothing. He hung up. I didn't hear from him again. Let me be honest with you about something. When I first learned about the trust, when I realized the full extent of what my father had built to protect his legacy, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, vindication, but also grief. Because my father spent his final years building a fortress instead of having honest conversations. He chose legal protection over confrontation. He managed the problem instead of solving it. And while I understand why he made those choices, he was sick, he was tired, he was afraid of dying alone. I can't help but wonder what might have been different if he trusted me enough to bring me into his confidence earlier. The trust protected his assets. But it couldn't protect the relationship we lost in those final years. It couldn't give us back the conversations we should have had, the time we should have spent together, the honesty that was buried under Vivian's careful management. Here's what I've learned from all of this. Money is a poor substitute for time, and legal victories don't heal emotional wounds. I would trade every dollar of that trust for one more honest conversation with my father. One more visit where Vivian wasn't hovering in the background, carefully curating what he said and what I heard. But I don't get to make that trade. None of us get to make that trade. The only choice we have is what we do with what we're given. I chose to honor my father's legacy by preserving what he built and using it to create something meaningful. I chose to forgive him for the years we lost, understanding that he did the best he could with the circumstances he faced. And I chose to move forward without bitterness toward Vivian, because holding on to anger would only keep me tethered to a past I couldn't change. If the story struck something in you, if you've ever watched a family member be manipulated or isolated by someone who claimed to be helping, I want you to hear this. You are not powerless. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And if you can, have the hard conversations before it's too late. The people who try to control access to loved ones are often the ones with the most to hide. The ones who insist they're protecting someone are often the ones doing the most damage. And the ones who claim to have someone's best interests at heart are often the ones whose interests are most self-serving. My father's final gift to me wasn't $20 million. It was the knowledge that he saw the truth, even if he couldn't act on it until the end. It was the proof that he trusted me, even if he couldn't say it out loud. It was the legacy of a man who built something lasting and made sure it would survive beyond his control. That's what I'm trying to pass on. Not just the money, but the lesson. Build your life on a foundation that can't be taken from you. Love people honestly even when it's hard. And when you see something wrong, say something before it's too late to matter. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it helped you see something in your own life more clearly, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Family Reckoning for more stories about justice, accountability, and the truth that sets families free. Because sometimes the people who think they've won are just the ones who haven't seen the full picture yet. And remember, the best revenge isn't cruelty. It's living well, honoring what you've been given, and building something that outlasts the people who tried to tear it down. Note: this story contains dramatic elements created for educational and entertainment purposes. While based on real patterns of estate manipulation and trust structures, specific details have been crafted to illustrate common legal frameworks and family dynamics. Always consult qualified legal professionals for actual estate planning or litigation matters.